People who saw a murder, what really happened. Story 1. When I was younger, I worked in a pub, handling tasks like clearing tables and emptying ashtrays, back in the days when smoking indoors was still allowed. One evening, I noticed a couple of guys standing at a high-top table, engaged in conversation. Suddenly, another man stormed in and immediately started shouting at one of them. Things quickly became heated, so I stepped in, trying to calm them down while discreetly removing empty glasses and bottles from the area. As I was speaking, the lone guy lunged forward with a knife. He missed me, but the blade sank into the chest of the man he had been arguing with. What happened next was pure horror. He pulled the wounded man into what almost looked like an embrace and proceeded to stab him 14 more times in the back before bolting out of the building. I spent what felt like an eternity applying pressure to the victim's wounds, desperately waiting for the ambulance to arrive, but by the time the paramedics got there, he was already gone. The police caught the attacker, and I had to give a statement, later spending several days in court testifying to help put him behind bars. That entire experience messed me up for a long time, and it's something I hope to never go through again. Story 2. Back in the 1980s, I was visiting the permanently docked Queen Mary in Long Beach, California. That day, a motorcycle show was taking place on board, and for some bizarre reason, they had hired the Hells Angels as security. The ship had several open staircases attached to the outside, allowing people to climb from the pavement level to various entry points. I happened to be standing on the lowest landing, about 10 feet above the ground, when the Mongols Motorcycle Club, rival gang to the Hells Angels, suddenly arrived. As expected, chaos erupted almost instantly. Fists, knives, and chains flew through the air as a full-on brawl broke out right below me. I witnessed one Mongol stab a Hells Angel in the back just as a string of police cars came speeding over the causeway. That night, I read in the newspaper that the victim had been stabbed in the kidney and didn't survive. Surprisingly, he was the only fatality of the fight. Story 3. When I was a kid, my dad was murdered. We lived in a rough part of Florida, and he was only 26 at the time. The night it happened, my babysitter had just arrived because my dad was going out, and she was there to watch my brother and me. I don't remember much, my brain blocked most of it out, but I know a group of people forced their way into the apartment, intending to rob us. Something went wrong, an argument broke out, and then I heard rapid gunfire. I was in a back room, but my brother was right there when it happened, and to this day, he carries the trauma of what he witnessed. I've gone through a lot of PTSD counseling, so I don't get as shaken up about it anymore. I've even thought about making a podcast to tell the story, especially since the whole case was a mess. The newspapers botched the reporting, accused the wrong people, and ultimately ruined any chance of real justice. It was a bizarre and frustrating experience for my family. Story 4. A friend of mine came to visit from Florida for just one night, and we decided to hit an after-hours club. I had a fake ID, but he was of legal age, so we didn't have any trouble getting in. We were outside smoking when a guy in a white car pulled up, stormed over, and started screaming at the bouncer while waving a gun in his face. Without missing a beat, the bouncer pulled out his own gun and shot him 6 times. The guy collapsed onto the hood of his car, covering it in blood, and died on the spot. Turns out, the whole thing happened because the bouncer had been sleeping with the guy's wife. The cops arrived, and unfortunately, a drunk girl we'd been chatting with decided to loudly tell them that we had witnessed the whole thing, but that it was a drive-by shooting. She was wasted and completely wrong, but the cops took her word for it and brought all 3 of us downtown as witnesses to a crime that didn't actually happen. Since I had given them my fake ID, I eventually had to come clean when they started questioning its legitimacy. The cop was annoyed but let it slide. We ended up stuck downtown for 11 hours, repeatedly telling them the same thing. No, it wasn't a drive-by, and yes, it was the bouncer. The cops already knew the truth, but thanks to that girl, they had to go through all the extra paperwork. They at least gave us cheese sandwiches and less smoke in the station, but it was still a miserable, drunken, sleepless night. My friend from Florida never visited again. Story 5. This happened around 2007. The The neighborhood I lived in was right on the border of two gang territories, so shootings were a near daily occurrence. One day, someone started firing down the street, either as part of a gang initiation or a fight. I wasn't old enough to fully understand the details. But what I do remember is a woman sitting in a blue car at the corner. She was panicked, and we stayed with her until EMS arrived. The image that sticks with me the most, even now, is seeing the fire department lay her on a stretcher, use a hand respirator, and then rush her away. Story 6. I used to live in a neighborhood filled with gang violence and drugs. It was the kind of place where the street would get shut down at least twice a year due to drug lab busts. Across from my house lived a drug dealer who owned a beautiful Dodge Charger that I always admired. One night, something must have gone wrong in a deal because I heard a lot of yelling. When I looked outside, I saw that his car had been set on fire, flames engulfing it. A few days later, as I was coming home, I saw the same guy running for his life, being chased by 3 or 4 men. One of them caught up to him and brutally beat him to death with a baseball bat. We moved out within the year. Story 7. In 2011, I was stationed in Leavenworth, Kansas, while serving in the military. One night, a few of us decided to go off-post and mess around at the local Walmart. On the way back, we heard gunshots. Thanks to our training, we immediately knew they were real. Definitely not fireworks or some other noise. We turned and saw a man darting between parked cars and a barbershop lot, desperately trying to avoid the bullets. He didn't make it. A few months later, I got out of the military and went home. Then, about a year later, I received a call from the Leavenworth County prosecutor saying I had to come back and testify. Being in town again made me feel like I was constantly being watched. After the trial, I never went back. I've witnessed and done some terrible things, but nothing haunts me quite like the sound of the victim's mother wailing in the courtroom as I described her son's final moments to the judge. Story 8. I'm exposed to this kind of thing pretty regularly, not necessarily murders, but death in general. The ones that stick with me the most are the wrong-way drivers. The most recent case happened on December 27th. A family was headed home, and you could see where both drivers had tried to avoid each other. Both vehicles were completely destroyed on the driver's side. The father, the family man, saved his wife's life by swerving the way he did. Long story short, we had to cut both cars apart to get them out. He died before we could extract him, but since he was still conscious when we arrived, we had to perform life-saving measures anyway. His 12-year-old daughter suffered a deep laceration down to her skull and will probably lose an eye, and his wife had some form of head trauma. The drunk driver, of course, survived, with just a broken leg. I've grown a little callous to things like this over the years, but the timing of this one really got to me. Just 2 days earlier, this family had been celebrating Christmas, and then some absolute jerk ruined their lives forever. To make matters worse, the family man's son had been in another vehicle right behind them and saw the whole thing happen. He had to watch us trying to get his parents and sister out of the wreckage. I felt for that kid, seeing his dad in that condition. Unfortunately, this wasn't the first or last time I've witnessed something like this. Story 9. Many years ago, I was at a pizza joint in Stockton for a company party. It was one of those places with long benches and tables, so different groups ended up sitting close to each other. If you know Stockton, then you know it's Northern California's version of South Central LA, so there were probably a few different gangs there that night. It was a big place, and I think it was a Friday or Saturday evening. At some point, a gang melee broke out, and a guy who had been sitting peacefully across from me just moments earlier had his head cracked open with one of those heavy glass beer mugs, the kind with a thick handle and a solid base. He went down immediately, blood pooling around him. I wanted no part of whatever was happening, so I walked straight for the front door. By the time I got there, the cops were already running in. A few days later, I found out that the guy had died in the hospital. Story 10. I'm not sure if the guy died, but I definitely witnessed an assault with deadly force. I grew up in a pretty rough town before transferring from community college. One day, I was outside the library when I saw an argument break out between an older man and a younger guy. The older man was dressed in what I'd call smart casual. He had a brown sweater, red chino pants, and leather shoes. He definitely wore glasses. I remember them getting knocked off his face. The younger guy was more nondescript, probably dressed in whatever streetwear was fashionable at the time, maybe tight jeans, bright colors, or something with a Sesame Street character on it. I couldn't hear what they were arguing about, but it could have been anything: a family dispute, a classmate conflict, or just two strangers who got into it. They were in each other's faces, and my initial assumption was that the younger guy had instigated something. Cooler heads seemed to prevail, and they begrudgingly separated, heading in opposite directions. Then, about 20 feet apart, the older man stole a backward glance, pivoted, and started stalking up behind the younger guy. No one said a word. Maybe we were all stunned by the assumption that the older man had been in the right. His first punch landed clean on the side of the younger man's head, but it didn't drop him. The second swing went wide as the younger man ducked and spun around to fight back. That's when the real fight started. People finally began shouting for them to stop. The younger guy was sloppy but faster, and eventually he landed a wide hook that sent the older man crashing to the ground. That's when things took a turn. Once the older man was down, the younger guy's temper flared even more. He kicked the man in the ribs and started yelling at him, and at all of us, about cheap shots and cowardice. No one responded. Then, he stomped on the older man's head. At first, there was no reaction from the crowd, or from the older man. But after the second stomp, his limbs started spasming, and that's when people finally reacted with shouts of protest. It didn't stop him. He delivered a third stomp with the same result. Finally, a friend of mine stepped forward and directly pleaded with the younger man to stop. That seemed to break the spell. After some back and forth about how no one cared when he was the one getting attacked, he stormed off. I was the first to call the police, but when they arrived, they seemed completely uninterested since the attacker was already gone. Nobody there had medical training, so the older man was left lying there until campus security arrived 15 minutes later. It took another 30 minutes before we finally heard sirens. I never got a follow-up call for testimony, no crime alert from campus notifications, nothing. As far as I know, the young guy got away with it. Story 11. Does war count as murder? I was in Iraq during the surge. I saw plenty of people meet horrible fates. The first time, I didn't even have a chance to process it. A guy in the Humvee next to me died, but I was too busy trying not to get killed myself to even acknowledge it. I didn't know until later that I had literally crapped myself in the chaos. Years later, I ended up in prison. On my second day there, as we were leaving the yard, I saw a guy step up and stab another dude about 10 times in the back. He crumpled to the ground. I did exactly what the guy next to me did, shut my mouth, stepped over the body, and kept moving. My reaction was just, so that's what a knifing in prison looks like. But the one that really sticks with me isn't that. It was the 18-year-old kid who got gang beaten by 5 guys. His screams at first, then his crying. Those sounds still haunt me.
I don't have much issue with death.
There are things worse than death. Story 12. Back in 2013, I was playing a show in downtown San Jose, California, on a Friday night. After finishing my last set, I stepped outside with a friend to smoke a cigarette. Looking down the street, I noticed 2 attractive women standing on the corner with a guy, waiting to cross. My attention was drawn to another man jaywalking across the busy street. He walked straight up to the guy with the 2 women and, without warning, sucker punched him with brutal force. I could hear the impact from half a block away. The man collapsed backward, cracking his head on the curb. The women screamed as my buddy and I ran over to help, but there was nothing we could do. He was convulsing, blood pouring from his ears, and biting his tongue to shreds. Desperate, the women took off their tops, trying to use them as bandages or pillows. Within moments, he stopped moving, and all that remained was a river of blood flowing from his skull. When the cops arrived, they took vitals, but 5 minutes later, a white sheet was placed over him. I never found out if they caught the man who did it. Story 12. When I was 13, my friend and I stayed up all night practicing Britney Spears' choreography when we heard noises outside. Peeking through the window, we saw a man viciously beating his pregnant girlfriend in their front yard. At the same time, a group of men was jumping another man off to the side. One of them pulled out a gun and unloaded on him. They then stuffed his body into a car and sped away. The police tried to get us to identify suspects, but I was never sure about the people they showed us. That wasn't the only murder I witnessed on that street. About a year ago, we were unloading groceries when two white men loitering on the corner suddenly ran into the street. They fired a gun straight into the windshield of a moving vehicle. My mom sprinted into the house at the sound of gunfire, but I froze, stuck in place like a deer in headlights. It all happened so fast. When I finally snapped out of it, I ran inside, finding my mom already on the phone with 911. When the police arrived, I saw the shooter talking to officers and called one over to tell them what I had seen. It turned out the men were undercover officers conducting a drug sting. They had murdered that man without ever identifying themselves as law enforcement to the suspect or anyone else. Story 13. When I was 6, my best friend Victor and I got off the school bus together, just like we did every day. We lived across the street from each other, and that day, he invited me over so we could change clothes and go play at the nearby park. We raced across the busy street, through our shortcut in the bushes, and into his yard, only to stop dead in our tracks. Victor's dad was in a screaming match with his own brother. Their shouts were filled with threats, their rage almost tangible in the air. I crept forward, hoping to slip into my friend's house unnoticed, but Victor ran straight toward his father, trying to stop the fight. That's when his uncle pulled out a gun. He screamed something, maybe, "I hate you, mother f***************, and then shot Victor's father in the chest right in front of us. Victor wailed as his dad crumpled to the ground. Frozen in shock, I couldn't move. His uncle stormed up, kicked Victor down, and turned toward me. Terrified, I finally found my voice and screamed. Victor, my friend, with tears in his eyes, lifted his hand and yelled, "Run. Call the police." I turned and sprinted. Tears blurred my vision as I ran through the bushes, across the street, and straight into my mother's apartment. I grabbed the phone with shaking hands and called 911. The police arrived soon after, but it was too late. Victor's dad was pronounced dead at the scene. The next day at school, Victor wasn't there. He never came back. In my gut, I knew the second gunshot I heard behind me had taken my best friend's life too. We were just two 6-year-olds trying to go to the park after school, and instead, we were caught in the middle of a family's violence.
A part of me died that day.
Years later, a therapist told me it was all just a false memory, a dream my mind had turned into reality. But I eventually tracked down Victor's relatives, and they confirmed everything. It really happened. What kind of therapist tells someone they didn't live through something unless they're absolutely sure? There had to be records of it. Losing my friend was one thing, but having to fight to prove that it even happened? That was another kind of nightmare. Story 14. I don't know if this qualifies as murder, but it should. The closest term I could find was depraved heart manslaughter. The day before Halloween this year, I was stopped at a red light at a notoriously chaotic intersection in my neighborhood. There was one car in front of me. The light turned green, and the driver ahead of me slowly started to accelerate. That's when everything changed in an instant. From our left, a mid-sized SUV came barreling through the red light, at least 3 or 4 seconds after it had already changed. He clipped the girl's car in front of me, ripping off her front bumper, then lost control and plowed straight into a grandmother waiting at the bus stop. She was gone instantly. She had just picked up a pizza for her family and was on her way home. Her life ended in a flash, all because of one reckless driver. His SUV tipped onto its driver's side, yet somehow, he got out almost immediately. And instead of checking on the woman he'd just killed, he had the audacity to start yelling at the girl whose bumper he had taken off, blaming her for being in the intersection, even though she had a green light. Meanwhile, she had literally spilled out of her car, wailing in disbelief, completely shattered by what had just happened. I was the first to call 911. The dispatcher asked if anyone could perform CPR, but all I could say was, "There's nothing left to perform CPR on." To my knowledge, the police ruled it an accident and nothing happened to the driver. A bystander turned to me and said, "We just watched that man make the worst mistake of his life." We did, and I hope he never, ever forgets it. Story 15. I was an ear witness to my brother's murder and an eyewitness to the perpetrator escaping. 30 years ago, my brother had gone with his girlfriend to look at some puppies when a jealous ex-husband decided to take matters into his own hands. He stormed in and opened fire, intent on killing every man in the house, including his ex-wife. He shot 4 people, but only one lost their life, my brother, who had never even met this woman before that night. I heard everything unfold and later had to identify his body at the scene. I've come to terms with that part, as painful as it is. But the one thing I still can't live with is how I handled telling my mother. When I had to call him home, I should have spoken to my father first so he could break the news in person. Instead, I told my mom over the phone. The wail she let out was worse than hearing those people cry out for help in their agony. That sound still haunts me to this day. Story 16. I've witnessed 3 tragic events in my lifetime. The first was in the early 90s. I was inside a convenience store playing a game, Fatal Fury or something like that, when I heard a loud pop followed by the screech of tires. At first, I thought it was just a car backfiring, but I ran outside and saw a man sitting on the sidewalk, clutching his stomach. Blood was beginning to pool on the pavement as a crowd gathered. Instead of staying out there, I went back inside, watching from behind the glass. Inside the store with me was a homeless black man who refused to leave. He kept saying, "They're going to arrest the first black guy they see." He was terrified, and honestly, I couldn't blame him. Later, I found out from the news that the man on the sidewalk had died. The second time was in the early 2000s. I was at home on my computer when I heard a series of gunshots. Living in a rough neighborhood, I was sadly used to hearing gunfire at night, so I didn't think much of it. But the next morning, police had swarmed the house next door. 3 college students had been murdered execution-style overnight. I left town not long after. The last one happened just a few months ago. I live next to a biker bar, and while it's mostly quiet, there was an incident over the summer. I was just about to fall asleep when I heard the roar of motorcycles revving up and down the street, followed by a single, unmistakable pop. I knew instantly what it was and reported it to the police before going to bed. The next morning, my street was completely cordoned off. In the middle of the road was a crashed bike. The body had already been taken away, but the blood was still there. Apparently, a bar fight had escalated, and someone chased down another biker and gunned him down right in front of my apartment complex. Story 17. Back in 2019, I was riding with a group of 4 motorcycles on an expressway. Traffic was moderately full, moving around 50 to 55 miles per hour despite the speed limit being 60. I'll never forget it. A lifted red 2018 F-150 was in the left lane, and he definitely looked behind him before merging right. He saw me and another rider ahead of me but failed to check his direct right. Without hesitation, he forced his way into the lane, cutting us off completely. In the process, he struck one of our riders, sending him crashing to the ground. He then slammed on his brakes, and the rider in front of me collided with the back of his truck, flying into the pickup bed on impact. I managed to avoid the collision by swerving ahead. Just seconds later, another F-150 clipped the lifted truck, further escalating the chaos. What enraged me most was the driver's reaction. He wasn't concerned about the riders he had just hit. Instead, he was furious about the damage to his brand new truck. He even had the audacity to argue with the other driver about who would cover the costs. Meanwhile, we scrambled to find our fallen friend. Though it probably only took a couple of minutes, it felt like forever. When we finally reached him, he looked fine, his helmet was intact, there was no visible blood, but he was completely unresponsive. We tried to get him to respond, shining a light in his eyes, but there was nothing. Ignoring every first aid rule I'd ever heard, We removed his jacket to check for a pulse. That's when we saw it, the sheer amount of blood pooling beneath him. I knew in that moment he was gone, but I still pressed down, desperately trying to stop the bleeding. It was useless. I started screaming at the truck driver, at my other friends, at my dead friend. I cursed everything, including myself, for convincing him to come on this ride. Then something inside me broke. I ran straight into the expressway, hoping to get hit, but my friends tackled me to the ground, holding me down until the paramedics arrived. In the end, the lifted F-150 driver faced no real consequences. He wasn't drunk, just careless. And the system protected him. He got off without so much as a slap on the wrist, while I was the one carted away in an ambulance because I had a breakdown. I didn't have health insurance. I still don't. I was drowning in medical debt just because I witnessed my friend's death. I lost everything. My job, my friends, my will to keep going. I couldn't even ride my bike anymore, and without it, I had no way to work. Now, I'm living in my girlfriend's apartment, barely holding on. I sleep on the couch because I don't want to get too close. She made me promise that once I see a therapist, I'll be myself again. I don't know if I can keep that promise, but I want to. I really do. I just don't know if next year will be any better. To anyone who reads this, I know it might not mean much, but I believe that driver murdered my friend. Maybe not legally, but his recklessness and arrogance stole a life and shattered others. It's been years, and I still hope that Opie has gotten the help they need. They deserved better. They all did. Story 18. At the time, my ex and I lived on the top floor of a 12-story apartment building. We got home around 11 p.m. after watching a movie, and about 30 minutes later, we heard a heated argument break out in the unit right across from ours. Through the peephole, I could see their front door, and within minutes, the altercation spilled into the hallway. It turned out that the woman who lived there had her ex, the father of her son, show up because she was having issues with her current boyfriend, who also lived with her. The confrontation escalated quickly. The two men got physical, and before I could fully process what was happening, the boyfriend stabbed the ex 3 times in the chest with a steak knife. I stood frozen at the peephole, paralyzed with fear, unable to do anything but urge my boyfriend to call the police. The attacker took off down the stairwell. I opened our door just as the wounded man collapsed forward, practically falling into my arms. He was bleeding heavily, and I could only sit there, trying to keep him conscious while waiting for paramedics. They arrived fast and rushed him to the hospital, while the police apprehended the suspect just a block away. I gave my statement that night, still wearing the blood-stained clothes. Despite everything, I still had to go to work the next morning. My supervisor had no sympathy, and at 20, I didn't know how to stand up for myself. The father survived, and we later visited him in the hospital, where he thanked us for saving his life. The following year was a blur of court proceedings, where we served as key witnesses. As far as I know, the boyfriend is still in prison. I don't think about that night often, but when I do, I can't shake the guilt of not opening the door sooner to try and stop it. Story 19. During my high school and early college years, my country was plagued by a brutal wave of violence tied to drug trafficking and organized crime. My city, in particular, was heavily affected. I ended up witnessing 2 murders, both while commuting to college. The first time, I was on a bus heading to the subway. I noticed a group of soldiers outside a convenience store. Seeing armed military personnel on the streets had become so common that it barely registered as unusual. But then, I saw a military truck parked nearby, and underneath it, a pair of legs, someone lying motionless on the ground. My naive 17-year-old mind assumed it was a homeless man asleep in the parking lot. Before I could look away, a soldier walked up, pointed his gun at the man, and pulled the trigger. I flinched as the man's legs jerked slightly, then went still. Blood pooled around him, darkening the soil. I didn't see the rest of it, but I saw enough. Later that day, the news reported that he was an extortionist. The second murder was even worse. I was on my way to college again, passing under a large vehicular bridge. I had walked this path countless times before, but this time, something was horribly different. Hanging from the highest point of the bridge was a man, a thick chain wrapped around his neck. Next to him, a large banner with threatening messages from a cartel was displayed, an ominous warning to their enemies. I don't know if the man was already dead, or if it was just the wind that made his body sway slightly, but the sight was burned into my mind. It was so disturbing that I had to undergo therapy for a long time just to process it. Story 20. About 5 or 6 years ago, I was heading home from church around 7 or 8 p.m. The country I live in gets dark fast, and by then, the streets were already shadowed in nightfall. As I walked, I suddenly heard 2 sharp screams from a nearby street, a street that was normally quiet, even at night. At the time, I was an impulsive teenager with a decent background in martial arts, so without thinking, I sprinted toward the sound to see what was happening. As I reached the street, I froze. A middle-aged man was sitting on a motorcycle, a gun in his hand. In the dim light, I watched as he pointed the weapon at an elderly woman and fired twice. She collapsed to the ground while the man bent down and grabbed what I assume was her purse. Panic flooded my body. There was no hesitation. I turned and ran. I fled back to the main street, taking the fastest route home. When I finally got there, I didn't say a word to my mother, and I certainly didn't call the police. Looking back, I know how foolish it was to run toward the danger in the first place. If he had seen me, I might not be here to tell the story. I kept this to myself for years, treating it as some grim lesson from life. This wasn't the only murder I ever witnessed, but it was the first and the most shocking. I was young, reckless, and completely unprepared for the brutal reality of the world outside my own. Story 21. Let me start by saying I wasn't in a dangerous neighborhood. It wasn't late at night, and there was no real reason for what happened. When you hear about someone witnessing a murder, the assumption is usually that they were in the wrong place or doing something they shouldn't have been doing. That wasn't the case for me. I always thought things like that happened in the dark of night. I also thought being at home was supposed to be safe. It was the middle of the afternoon, and I was at my boyfriend's apartment. We were playing video games when we suddenly heard gunshots from outside. We were on the second floor, looking out over the common area. That's when we saw it, a toddler, face down on the ground, and a woman yelling at a man approaching the child. At first, I thought maybe the kid had fallen, and the woman was just yelling at the man to help. But no. The man walked right over to the unconscious toddler and began stabbing the child repeatedly with a metal object. At first, we thought it was a knife, but later found out it was a screwdriver. I screamed and turned away from the window. I quickly turned to my boyfriend and asked him if he saw what I saw. I immediately called the police while he grabbed his gun. I didn't know if the man had one too, so I hid out of sight. On the phone, I described everything, the situation, what the man looked like, and where we were. Meanwhile, my boyfriend told the man to stop. The guy just kept pacing, not stopping his attack on the child, so my boyfriend fired. We were on the second floor, and from the man's position, it was impossible to aim higher than his legs without potentially shooting into another apartment downstairs. So the shot hit him in the leg, and that caught his attention. He immediately started begging my boyfriend to end him. He said that the child was the best thing in his life, and he deserved to die. I was still on the phone with the operator, crying, begging them to hurry. I could hear everything that was happening, but I honestly didn't know what was coming next. The man finally stopped attacking the child.
Just then, the police arrived.
My boyfriend lowered his weapon, removed the bullet from the chamber, and set it down. He later told me that he could see the fear in the neighbors' eyes when they saw him. The police took us in for questioning separately. We both said we didn't know who the man was or who the child was, and that we'd never seen them around before. But after returning home, we realized that the man was actually one of our neighbors. We'd seen him a few times, waved hello, and heard him arguing with his girlfriend occasionally, but we didn't know they had a child. Sadly, the child didn't survive. The father ended up in jail, and the mother was at work when it happened. Afterward, my boyfriend got his license to carry, and I'm working on mine now. I carry my gun everywhere, as long as it's within the law. People call me a worrywart, thinking I'm overreacting, but after seeing something like that, you start to realize that danger is everywhere. Loud noises, even something as harmless as fireworks, scare me. If I hear shouting or an argument, I immediately stop whatever I'm doing to figure out if there's any danger. I've been in therapy for years now, and I'm justifiably terrified. I'm always aware that anything can happen at any moment. But on the flip side, I've gained a deeper appreciation for life. I know people say it all the time, but I really mean it. I live every day like it could be my last. You never know. I don't hurt others out of malice or petty reasons, and I don't say things I might regret. I try to be honest and open about my feelings because life is too short to waste. If I have something to say, I'll say it. I believe in love, in togetherness, and in making the world a better place, as long as you put your heart into it. I always tell my family and friends I love them because you just never know when things could change. I've been wanting to share this experience with people, but it often flies over their heads. No one truly gets it until they experience something tragic or lose someone close to them. Thank you for giving me a space to share this story. Story 22. When I was around 10 years old, I witnessed something that still haunts me. My father and I were living in a motel at the time, and my godfather and his son were visiting. My godbrother, who was about 16, was outside when he got into a confrontation with a man who was wearing some kind of racist shirt. The man pulled out a gun and shot my godbrother 3 times in the chest. We were in the pool area at the time, and my godbrother was just on the sidewalk nearby, within view. After he was shot, my godfather immediately tackled the shooter and held him down until the police arrived. Everything after that is kind of blurry in my memory. I was young and terrified. I remember being physically sick for a long time afterward, even missing school until after the funeral. Looking back, I'm grateful to live in an area where gun violence is rare and murders are even rarer. Stories like this make you appreciate the life you have. They definitely made me realize how fragile life is. This thread has really made me reflect. It's a heavy topic, and I want to encourage everyone reading this to take some time for themselves. Do something you enjoy, eat some good food, just take a break. But for now, thank you for taking the time to read my story. I hope you have a wonderful day or night, wherever you are, and I'll see you in the next one.